Daniel Carter and Emily Carter were newly married, deeply in love, and eager to begin the first journey of their life together, which is why they chose a quiet road trip honeymoon to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, believing that the long highways, cold mountain air, and endless forests would offer them peace, romance, and unforgettable memories. And on a calm evening, they packed their luggage into their car and began driving toward the mountains, unaware that this journey would soon turn into something far darker than either of them could imagine, as the city lights slowly faded behind them and the road stretched endlessly ahead, becoming narrower, darker, and more isolated with every passing mile, while dense forests rose on both sides of the highway like silent walls, swallowing all sound except the hum of the engine. And as midnight approached, the road became completely empty, with no other cars, no gas stations, and no streetlights, creating an uneasy stillness that Emily couldn't quite explain, though she tried to ignore it by talking to Daniel, laughing softly, and reminding herself that this was supposed to be the happiest trip of their lives. But the deeper they drove into the mountains, the heavier the silence felt, as if the forest itself was watching them. And for a brief moment, Daniel, relaxed by the quiet drive and distracted by conversation, looked away from the road, and in that exact second something ran across the highway, followed by a sudden, violent impact that shook the entire car, forcing Daniel to slam the brakes as Emily screamed in shock, her heart racing as the car skidded to a stop. And for a few seconds neither of them spoke, frozen in fear, listening to the sound of their own breathing, before Daniel stepped out of the car, his hands trembling slightly as he walked toward the front under the headlights, where he discovered a black cat lying motionless beneath the bumper, its body twisted unnaturally, clearly dead. And although neither of them were superstitious, the sight of the black cat filled Emily with an unexplained sense of dread, as if something had gone terribly wrong, while Daniel felt a deep guilt settle over him, knowing the accident was his fault. And instead of leaving the body on the road, they decided to carry the cat into the nearby forest, where the trees stood tall and close together, blocking out the moonlight and making the air feel cold and heavy. And there, in the silence of the woods, they dug a shallow grave using their hands and a small roadside tool, burying the cat beneath loose soil and fallen leaves, never noticing how unnaturally quiet the forest had become during the burial, as if even the insects had stopped making noise. And once the task was done, they returned to the car, both shaken but eager to put the incident behind them, convincing themselves it was nothing more than an unfortunate accident. Yet as they drove away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, glancing repeatedly into the side mirror as if expecting to see something following them. And barely 10 minutes later, without any warning, the car began to slow down before the engine completely died, leaving them stranded in the middle of the highway, surrounded by darkness, forest, and absolute silence. And no matter how many times Daniel tried to restart the engine, it refused to respond, while their phone showed no signal at all, increasing Emily's fear as she realized how isolated they truly were. And standing outside the car, under a sky filled with clouds and no visible stars, the cold mountain air felt sharper, more hostile, as if the night itself was closing around them. And it was then that Emily, fighting panic, suggested they walk forward and look for any sign of a building or shelter, since staying beside a broken car in the middle of nowhere felt far more terrifying. And as they walked along the deserted road, their footsteps echoed, unnaturally loud in the silence, every shadow between the trees appearing to move, until finally, in the distance, Daniel noticed a dim structure standing alone beside the road, barely visible through the darkness. And as they got closer, they realized it was an old guest house, its walls worn, windows dark, and paint peeling, looking abandoned yet strangely intact. And although something about the place made Emily uneasy, the exhaustion and fear of the night pushed them forward, convincing themselves that any shelter was better than none, unaware that by stepping inside, they were walking straight into a place where the rules of the normal world no longer applied. As Daniel and Emily stood outside the old guest house, an uneasy feeling settled over them. Because the building looked far older than anything else along the highway, its wooden exterior cracked and weathered by time, with several windows boarded up and only a single dim light glowing faintly near the entrance. Yet with the cold growing stronger and the silence pressing around them, they had little choice but to step inside, where the air immediately felt stale and heavy, carrying a faint smell of dust and something unpleasant they couldn't quite identify. And behind the reception desk sat an elderly woman, thin and motionless, her pale eyes fixed forward as if she had been waiting for them. And when Daniel politely asked if they could have a room for the night, the woman did not respond at first, slowly lifting her head to look at them with an empty expression before silently sliding a rusted key across the counter, avoiding all eye contact, a gesture so unnatural that Emily felt a chill run through her spine, yet exhaustion overpowered her fear, and they accepted the key without further questions. But as they turned to walk toward the staircase, Emily suddenly stopped, her body freezing in place as her eyes locked onto something sitting in the shadow corner of the hallway. And when Daniel turned to see what she was staring at, Emily let out a sharp scream, pointing in terror at a black cat sitting perfectly still near the stairs, its eyes reflecting the dim light. And in that moment her heart raced as she became convinced that this was the same cat they had buried earlier, identical in size, color, and even the faint mark on its fur, and shaking violently. She begged Daniel to leave immediately, insisting something was wrong with this place. But Daniel, though unsettled himself, tried to reason with her, explaining that black cats were common in rural areas and that fear and exhaustion were likely playing tricks on her mind. And although Emily wasn't convinced, she forced herself to believe him, telling herself she was overreacting, especially when the cat disappeared into the darkness without making a sound, and slowly they made their way up the creaking wooden stairs to their room, where the dim lighting and outdated furniture made the space feel cold and unwelcoming, yet they locked the door behind them, hoping the worst of the night was over. But even as Daniel unpacked their bags and tried to lighten the mood, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, every small sound making her flinch, every shadow seeming to stretch unnaturally across the walls. And when she finally decided to take a shower to calm her nerves, the sound of running water briefly drowned out the silence, offering her a false sense of comfort, until she stood alone in the bathroom, brushing her hair in front of the fog mirror, trying to steady her breathing, when suddenly she noticed movement behind her reflection, and as her eyes focused, her heart nearly stopped, because standing behind her in the mirror was a black cat, perfectly still, staring directly at her. And before she could react, another reflection slowly appeared beside it, the elderly woman from the reception desk. Except her face was no longer human, her features twisted unnaturally, her eyes dark and hollow, and in that moment Emily let out a piercing scream as terror overwhelmed her, her legs giving way as she collapsed unconscious onto the bathroom floor. While outside the bathroom, Daniel heard her scream and rushed to the door, pounding on it desperately and calling her name, but receiving no answer, and as panic set in, he tried to force the door open, only to realize it was locked from the inside, leaving him helpless and terrified and convinced something was terribly wrong. He ran down the hallway toward the reception desk to find the old woman and demand the master key, his footsteps echoing loudly through the empty guest house. But when he reached the desk, he found it completely abandoned, the light flickering weakly above, casting long shadows across the walls. And as his eyes scanned the room, his breath caught in his throat, because written across the wall in dark, dripping letters was a single word: death. And beneath it, lying on the floor, was a lifeless body of a black cat, its eyes open and unblinking, identical to the one they had seen earlier. And as fear gripped him completely, Daniel realized that whatever was happening in this place was beyond logic, beyond reason, and that by stepping into this guest house, they had crossed into something they did not understand, something that had been waiting for them since the moment that cat died on the road. Frozen with fear after seeing the word written in blood and the lifeless black cat on the floor, Daniel felt his legs weaken as the horrifying realization began to sink in that the guest house was not just abandoned, but alive with something dark and aware. And with his heart pounding violently in his chest, he turned and ran back toward the room, desperate to reach Emily before it was too late. The hallway seeming longer than before as the lights flickered overhead, and the walls creaked softly, as if responding to his panic. And when he reached the door and forced it open, the sight before him shattered his remaining sense of reality, because standing in the center of the room was a tall, shadowy figure in inhuman shape, its limbs unnaturally long, its presence filling the air with an unbearable pressure, and suspended in the air by her throat was Emily, her body limp, her eyes closed, as if life itself was slowly being drained from her. And Daniel screamed her name and rushed forward, but an invisible force threw him back against the wall, knocking the breath from his lungs. And as he struggled to stand, tears streaming down his face, he begged the entity to let her go, insisting they never intended to harm anyone. that what happened on the road was an accident, and for a moment the creature remained silent, its head slowly turning toward him, before its voice filled the room, low and unnatural, echoing as though coming from everywhere at once. And it revealed that the black cat they had killed was not merely an animal, but something bound to it, something they protected and watched over for a very long time. And at the moment its life was taken, a bond had been broken, awakening a hunger for revenge that could not be ignored. And as Daniel pleaded for mercy, promising to do anything, the entity explained that the guest house was not a place for travelers, but a trap, a space that existed between worlds, where those marked by guilt and death were, drawn without knowing why, and that the old woman Daniel had seen was only a form it used to appear harmless, while the cat was another shape it could take, allowing it to follow them unnoticed from the road to the forest, from the forest to the guest house, and finally into their room. And with every word, Daniel's hope faded as he realized there was no escape, because this thing had never intended to spare them. And despite his final desperate cries, the entity's grip tightened as its claws extended, slicing into Emily's throat in a single brutal motion, killing her instantly as her body fell lifelessly to the floor, and Daniel screamed in agony, crawling toward her, holding her bloody body in his arms as his mind broke under the weight of what he had witnessed. And as the room fell silent once more, the shadowy figure slowly faded into darkness, leaving behind nothing but death and unbearable grief. And in that moment, Daniel understood that he could not leave this place, that whatever force ruled this guest house would never allow him to escape. And consumed by despair, guilt, and the loss of the woman he loved, Daniel took his own life beside Emily, ensuring that the room would never again know peace. And when morning came, the guest house stood silent and empty, showing no sign that anyone had ever been there. And days later, when authorities finally investigated reports of a broken-down car along Pine Ridge Road, they found no guest house at all, only an empty clearing surrounded by forest. Yet weeks later, Daniel and Emily's bodies were discovered buried in a distant cemetery miles away, their deaths officially ruled unexplained, with no record of how or when they had been moved, leaving behind an unsolved mystery that still haunts the region, as locals whisper that the guest house appears only to those who are marked, that the black cat is seen wandering the highway late at night, and that some forces do not forgive accidents, do not accept apologies, and do not belong to the world we think we understand, raising one final terrifying question: how many other travelers have vanished after believing they were alone on an empty road?